Story 1. Not mine, but my wife's shock. She lost her birth certificate and called another state in the United States to request a replacement. The woman on the other end said, "No problem. Just tell me your parents' names as they appear on the certificate I am holding now." My wife gave her mother's name, which matched. She gave her father's name, which was wrong. Her mother had divorced and taken her, running off to another state halfway across the country and hidden from her paternal family. She spent 3/4 of her life believing the man her mother was married to was her father. Her mother had altered the birth certificate. She has since met her real father's family and developed a relationship with them. Story 2. As a teenager, I found out a sibling was my half-sibling. A few years later, I learned I had another sibling, and a few years after that, I discovered another one. By the third surprise, the shock had started to wear off. Someone asked if I am Meredith Grey. Pretty much the redneck version, yes. My school was destroyed by a tornado and we had to attend classes in a Walmart for a while. An uncle was arrested on more than 30 counts of various offenses, and I was publicly shunned at a wedding rehearsal for suggesting we not bring him to a wedding with children. My mother was a mortician and broke her back pulling a body out of a canal. My father fell out of the tree he was cutting when he cut the branch he was sitting on. He broke both legs and was almost taken out by the chainsaw. I found him in a fire ant bed. One sister had a clothing iron fall on her face. Another sister drowned in the family pool and was resuscitated after being saved by our 8-year-old brother. I almost lost my finger to a 1930s air compressor. A gesture toward Hurricane Katrina. One sister was at a sleepover at what I later learned may have been a Ku Klux Klan friendly house when she and her friends were shot at while sleeping in a tent. She was shot by the homeowner. I have been working on a book for years, but biographies are generally only successful if readers care about the author. I am just a bitch with a backstory. The attention this has received might get me off my ass to work on it again. The working title was award-winning Butthole, but bitch with a backstory works too. Story 3. Breast cancer runs in my dad's family. My grandmother was one of 6 children, 5 daughters and 1 son. My dad has a lot of first cousins. I think there are 24 of them. About 15 years ago, one of them developed breast cancer and went to the oncologist and surgeon her doctor recommended, a man who had been doing this for more than 40 years. She had a distinctive name, and while he was performing the exam, the doctor said, "I know this is strange, but you wouldn't happen to be her mother's daughter, would you?" My dad's cousin asked, "Yes. How did you know my mother?" The doctor replied, "She was my very first solo mastectomy patient, and she kept talking about her children. She was very proud of you and your brother." My cousin responded, "What are you talking about? My mother didn't have breast cancer." The doctor said, "Wasn't your mother the woman I operated on? I did her surgery, and then a year later I did her sister's surgery when she was diagnosed. That is how we found out that at least 2 of the sisters had breast cancer and had never told anyone except possibly their husbands. Not their daughters, not their nieces, nobody. That is how all 14 of my father's female first cousins and all of their daughters ended up having genetic testing, and how we discovered that of 27 women across 2 generations, only my first cousin and I do not carry mutations in the breast cancer susceptibility genes BRCA1 and BRCA2. That was fun." Story 4. My uncle used to seem fine, but he has walked and sat oddly for the past several years and I was never sure why. It turns out he was caned in Malaysia as punishment for an attempted robbery. He negotiated for reduced jail time, but the number of strokes was high and it has caused permanent chronic pain in that area. Story 5. I put my information on a genetic website after I discovered my late mother had been forced to give up a child for adoption when she was young. The half-sibling who found me was from my father. More the merrier, apparently. Story 6. I did not find out until my mid-30s that my grandmother had shot and killed her first husband with his service revolver when she walked in on him trying to smother their crying baby. She was acquitted. It was ruled a justifiable homicide. Her second husband drowned under mysterious circumstances. She went on to raise all 7 children on her own. My grandmother and my father used to hunt black bears to help feed everyone. When I was 9 or 10, while she was teaching me to play poker, she told me that back then I would have been shot dead for dealing that poorly. Granny did not mess around. Story 7. When my aunt died unexpectedly of a stroke, my uncle discovered that she had a storage unit he did not know about. In that storage unit was a 55-gallon drum containing the body of her abusive ex. She was a mild-mannered, sweet suburban mom. Absolutely no one saw that coming. Story 8. I found out when I was 26 that I had an older brother who had been put up for adoption. My mother had him as a teenager in the 1970s and arranged a no-contact adoption. He went to an unknown family. The only living people in my family who knew about it were my mother, her sister, and my father, whom she married years later. I discovered it while using the genealogy website Ancestry to look for my grandfather's Korean War records. I did not know my brother's name, but my mother has a very distinct name, and the website listed her name, age, and birth location as his possible mother. After seeing this, I called my mother and she confirmed his existence. We have met a few times, and it is cool to see the similarities we share. Story 9. I am shocked that my family is willing to accept a family member who committed sexual assault against his ex-wife. He spent 8 years in prison for raping her while she was passed out drunk and uploaded the recording to a pornographic website. Yet I am labeled weird and flaky because I refuse to attend family gatherings when he is present. I remain gobsmacked years later. Story 10. When I was 14, I accidentally found out I had an older brother. I never met him at the time, but we had attended the same schools. He was just 1 year ahead of me, so we were never there at the same time. I actually met him when I was 30. I only had 20 years with him before he passed away. But his family has always been a big part of my life since then. Story 11. Thanks to genetic genealogy sites, we recently discovered that my grandfather had not one, but 2 secret children that nobody knew about. He was a traveling salesman in the 1940s. Story 12. 10 years ago, I reunited with my older sister and my father's side of the family. It turned out that my younger siblings and I were part of a hidden family. We had no idea. I knew my dad had been married previously and that I had a sister, but I did not know that my mother and I were kept secret for 2 years while he was still married. It was shocking. Story 13. My great-uncle shot his father, my great-grandfather, with a shotgun when he was 12. I learned about this while researching newspaper archives for information about when my father played sports in high school and college. The newspaper article included a quote from a neighbor. We always knew there was something not right about that family. Story 14. I found out a few years ago that my mother was engaged to someone else when she met my father. They refused to discuss what happened. An aunt let a small detail slip, and I would love to know the full story. Story 15. My grandfather and my uncles all cheated on their wives, which resulted in a number of cousins finding me on 23andMe. Story 16. My family lied about causes of death, and it was extremely painful because I went decades without knowing our history of suicide and mental illness. Car accidents, falls, natural causes, and liver cancer were often reported, but many were actually suicides or the result of late-stage alcoholism. Cancer was sometimes used to hide acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Story 17. My uncle murdered 3 girls in Placerville, California, in the 1980s and has been on death row at San Quentin since 1986. Story 18. I discovered that I have a half-brother. He is 1 year older than my oldest brother. He was adopted. His biological mother was engaged to my father, but she ended it and placed the child for adoption because she did not believe in divorce and could not see herself married to my father for life. My mother gave me all the information he would need to find his birth family. She said she knew he was out there because my father had told her the whole story. Story 19. When I was in my 20s, my great-grandmother lived with me for a few years after I first bought my home. One day, as I was leaving for work, my aunt pulled into my driveway. I stopped to say hello. She said she just wanted to visit Grandma and told me Uncle Jimmy had died. I asked, "Who the hell is Uncle Jimmy?" and laughed. It turned out he was my great-grandmother's youngest son, who had been in prison since before I was old enough to remember him. Most of us great-grandchildren did not know about him until he died in 2005. He had been incarcerated since 1985. Story 20. I found out that one of my aunts was raped while she was traveling on a ship. To avoid scandal, my grandparents made an arrangement with the rapist. They would not press charges as long as he married my aunt. He married her, and the matter was kept secret until my aunt died a few years ago. She had a hard life, trapped and chained to a monster who abused her. The biggest blow for me was that my grandparents failed as parents. They thought marrying my aunt off to that monster would save her reputation. No wonder she became mentally ill. Story 21. My cousin, who was a year older than my father, was actually my father's brother. My grandmother gave him to her sister to raise because she already had 2 children and no financial support from my grandfather. He was a spitting image of my father, and it was obvious to everyone. The upsetting part is that after giving him away, my grandmother went on to have 2 more children. Story 22. 1. My aunt became pregnant as a teenager in the 1960s. She was sent away to finish her pregnancy and was forced to give the child up for adoption. We never heard anything about him after that. The child tracked her down about 5 years ago through deoxyribonucleic acid testing. He is a wonderful man, and we are glad to have him in our family now. 2. We found out just last year that when my grandparents married in 1948, my grandmother was pregnant with another man's child. My grandfather knew and married her anyway. This came to light because my cousin had his deoxyribonucleic acid tested and discovered that he shared 50% less genetic material with his grandparents than expected. Moral of the story: do not have your deoxyribonucleic acid tested unless you are prepared to learn unexpected things. Story 23. Grandma was a sex worker, specifically a phone sex operator. She lived with us while we were growing up to help with childcare and family finances. She used the money from that work to pay for dance lessons for my sisters and me, so we would be out of the house 3 nights a week and she could watch her programs in peace on the color television in the living room. She also had a regular job. She worked part-time as a Spanish translator in the collections department of a major bank. She was a very proper Southern Catholic woman. I did not learn about the phone sex work until a decade after she died. Shocked was an understatement. Story 24. I grew up in a very conservative, pro-life family that opposed sex before marriage. As an adult, I learned that 2 women in my family had abortions when they were young, both before marriage. They remain pro-life today. Over the years, I have read articles about how some conservative women justify their own abortions while condemning those of others. It was shocking to see this in my family. Story 25. Triple threat post. I knew growing up that my grandmother had been a postulant, a nun in training, but left the church to marry my grandfather. They had 2 children. Sometime later they divorced. Catholics do not do the whole divorce thing, so I suspected something was off. But who am I to question Grandma? The other woman she lived with was just a golfing buddy and roommate, right? Turns out she was gay. My grandfather was an unknowing beard and sperm donor, and as soon as she had the children she wanted, she moved out. She and her partner spent 20 to 30 years together after my mother and her sister grew up. They played golf, traveled the United States, and gave their dogs a lot of love. Here is why this is a triple threat. I learned about this a few years ago on a trip to visit that side of the family, far from where I live, and 5 minutes before this revelation I also learned that my aunt and uncle really love their state's medical marijuana laws. Wait, so you are telling me the Catholic side of my upbringing came from a bunch of marijuana-using women in same-sex relationships? Story 26. A family friend who was always over was a child molester. Many people knew and simply kept him away from children. I have never forgiven them for allowing it and for saying it was different in the 1960s and 1970s. Fucking boomers. Story 27. The brain of a person with narcissistic personality disorder is different from the brain of someone without the disorder. Nothing I say or do will change that significantly, so I can relax and stop trying to have a normal relationship. Story 28. Finding a surprise half-sister on Ancestry was a bit of a shock. Dad was not married when she was conceived, and he has no memory of her mother. My other half-sister said, "It was the 1970s and he had a van." Story 29. I thought my grandfather died of cancer when I was 5. When I was 28, I learned he had shot himself in the yard because he did not want cancer to take him. My grandmother found him. Story 30. My story is that my uncle kidnapped my cousin when he was a baby from his mother, whom he divorced shortly after my cousin was born. He took the baby across the border to the United States, where an airplane was waiting with my grandmother. After they took off, my grandmother raised my cousin for a year, hiding in the mountains of Durango, Mexico. When they returned to my grandmother's hometown in Mexico, she raised him as her son. This happened in the early 1970s before cell phones or Amber Alerts. The reason my uncle went to that extreme was that the mother had crossed into the United States and her new significant other at the time introduced her to drugs. My father crossed the border frequently for work and said he was stopped every time and asked about my uncle. My father and uncle never had a good relationship, so when my father told them each time that he did not know and did not care, he meant it. He also helped raise my cousin and helped pay for his education. Story 31. My mom started a ferret sanctuary without telling anyone over the past couple of years. Now she has more than 120 ferrets living in her home. She just sent me a picture. Story 32. My dear, sweet grandfather was a total bastard before I was born. My grandmother, my uncles, and others I do not know all suffered physical and psychological trauma because of him. I still cannot picture it. Story 33. I'll go first. I just found out my aunt and uncle are 10 years apart. When my aunt was in her early 30s, she worked at a local night spot while attending community college. Just before she graduated, she met my uncle, who was in his early 20s and struggling financially. She began making good money and thought he was very handsome, like a young John Travolta. She also wanted to travel but had no one to go with her, so she offered to cover his portion of the trips if he would go with her and keep her company abroad. They traveled everywhere: Japan, Iceland, Australia, and more. They never made anything official. For years later, they married on a cruise in the Netherlands without invites or planning. 2 years later, they had my cousins and settled down in the mountains. All this time, I thought they were the same age and had met in college. I later discovered my aunt was the older partner supporting him. Story 34. Growing up, I was very close to my cousin. We were best friends, and I took care of her because of physical medical conditions she was born with. When I was about 10, I learned she was actually my sister. My aunt had adopted her after Child Protective Services removed her from my parents, believing the medical condition, which caused many bruises, was child abuse. My parents and my aunt fought in court until they went bankrupt. The case made the front page of the newspaper and even appeared on a Jerry Springer-style television show in the 1980s. We are still very close, but it was a strange shock when I found out. Story 35. When I was 12, I found paperwork stashed in the basement showing that my older sister and I had different fathers than the man who was raising us. When I mustered the nerve to ask my very conservative acting mom, she told me my sister was the result of a brief fling when my mother was 18, and I was from a previous marriage to a man who died in Vietnam. My birth father had been married before, and I also had 3 half-siblings from that marriage. It explained why my younger brothers were treated so much better than my sister and I were, and why I went off the rails as a teenager. Story 36. My favorite uncle growing up married my father's sister. They were double income, no children, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and the kind of people to have wine with every dinner. I never saw my uncle not wearing a collared shirt, and the most activity I ever saw him do was play golf. He was a hoot, jovial, and solidly upper middle class. I had known him my entire life. I was in my late 20s and had been married for several years when we were visiting town and went out to dinner with the family. During the conversation, he casually mentioned he had a Silver Star. I didn't even know he had been in the military. Apparently, he served in Air Force Special Operations during the Vietnam War and received a Silver Star for actions in Cambodia. I said I didn't know we were at war with Cambodia during Vietnam. He explained we weren't. He was assisting a Central Intelligence Agency unit that had been trapped at an installation. Rest in peace, Uncle Jimmy. A man with a terrible chip shot and the ability to kill people with a pencil. Story 37. I recently learned that my paternal grandfather pushed my grandmother, who was very pregnant with twins, down the stairs so she would lose the babies. She lost the twins. Story 38. My aunt, my mother's half-sister, couldn't find me on 23andMe. That led us to discover that my grandmother had an affair with a traveling salesman in 1951. We contacted his relatives, and their response was, "Oh no, not another one." Story 39. My grandmother's family was heavily involved with the Irish mob in Boston. Her father and uncles were low-level enforcers. I learned this after she passed. We were laughing about how she always insisted on sitting facing the door at restaurants, and my grandfather said, "She learned that from her dad. So you can see somebody coming in if they're trying to kill you." He told us more stories after that, including how his father-in-law's superiors were heavily involved in garbage collection-related extortion. Story 40. My mother had an affair with my high school best friend. We no longer speak. Story 41. My grandfather rode motorcycles. I never knew this growing up. He never talked about it, and I had never seen one at his place. 2 years ago, we went to visit him for Christmas. He took my husband and me out to the car barn. I knew he had restored 1957 Chevys, so I figured he wanted to show off his current project. He took us to a side room and pulled a sheet off an intact 1959 Cushman Eagle. It was rusty, but all the parts were there. Then he pointed to another sheet and we pulled it off. There was a Frankenstein-style bike with a lawnmower engine. Then he pulled out a picture of himself riding it. It turns out he had been pretty wild in his youth, and my grandmother never let him ride again. But he kept a few projects in the barn so that one day he could. He passed away on Christmas Eve last year. That Cushman Eagle now sits in my garage so I can get it running again. Story 42. I have a cousin whose grandmother was a dissident in Chile under the Pinochet regime and was imprisoned for a little over a year. Unfortunately, she committed suicide within a year of her release. The torture was horrible, and she was a personal victim of Ingrid Olderock, known as the Lady of the Dogs, who led the regime's secret canine discipline team. Story 43. Grandma had an affair, and that is why she and Grandpa divorced. My aunt said Grandma's affair partner moved in the same day Grandpa moved out. They never spoke ill of one another, so as a child I assumed it was amicable. Dad had already moved away for college by then, so this was news to him as well. Story 44. My grandfather ran away from home because his stepfather sexually abused him and his younger brother. My great-grandmother knew and sent his sisters away. She had met the man because he was a client, which explained why my grandfather hated his mother. Story 45. When my grandmother was in the hospital on her deathbed, they removed a bridge from her upper teeth. No one in the family knew it existed. She had worn it for 60 years. She met my grandfather at 19 and had my father a year later. My grandfather was in a motorcycle club, and this happened in the 1950s. She said they attended a party at his clubhouse and became very drunk. She got up on a table and insulted him. The other bikers began making fun of him, and he walked over and punched her square in the mouth, knocking out all her teeth. They broke up, and my father was raised by someone else. She never told him or anyone about it. We only found out because of a morphine confessional. Story 46. Not long before he was lost to dementia, my father started writing his autobiography. The first shock was that his English was so poor. I had thought he was better educated. It turned out his mother was a woman who somehow made a living from the sailors in a naval town. His paternity was never clear to him. He remembered sleeping in a bed with 3 siblings. His mother had another baby, which was added to the sleeping arrangement. One morning he woke up and the baby was dead next to him. His grandmother and her husband ran a naval tailor shop in another naval town, and one day she intervened. That changed his whole future. He went to live above the shop and was sent to the local school. He did well enough to go to the grammar school in the next town, commuting by train. When he matriculated, he got an apprenticeship with a local company that had a shipyard and several coastal steamers. When World War II broke out, he was still an apprentice. In the naval harbor, there was an anti-aircraft ship, an old merchant vessel armed with anti-aircraft guns, moored to protect the dockyard from Stuka dive bombers. The guns were fired automatically to create a box barrage over the dockyard. One day the Stukas came for that ship and sank it. The water was full of floating bodies, and my father was sent out with the launches to recover them. He was 19. He finished his apprenticeship and began his career as a ship's engineer, mostly on tankers. His ship was sunk 3 times. Most of the war he spent crossing the Atlantic. He told of the times he spent in New York waiting for a ship to be repaired. A young, handsome man in uniform, he said, never had to pay for anything and had the time of his life. I got no details, just a grin. In this period he reckoned he broke the world record for climbing an engine room ladder every time there was a bang. He saw terrible sights when other tankers were hit. After the war, he still had an exciting life. He was a top engineer for diesel-powered ships working for Shell. He would be flown first class around the world to fix problems. Once he was offered a job in Australia, but my mother did not want to leave her family. I nearly became an Australian. He was very proud of his war service, although as a merchant seaman he received no official recognition. There is a book called British Merchant Losses in World War II or something similar. It lists the ship sunk and gives brief accounts of what happened to each crew. Heartbreaking stuff. When a ship was sunk, the owners stopped paying the crew immediately. After a sinking, the surviving crew were sent on another ship with no choice. They were not even allowed to join the armed forces, which would have been safer. My dad was a quiet, unassuming man with some amazing skills in the workshop. He could take scrap and make something useful. He made a fully functional lathe out of a bedstead and a washing machine. As he said, when you are on a ship 1,000 miles from help and it stops working, someone has to improvise. Story 47. My family is poor but wealthy in health. I know it's not that shocking. Story 48. My dad told me this as a funny story. I am the third child. When my mother discovered she was pregnant a third time, she was in her late 30s and had already had 2 cesarean sections for my siblings. They were using protection, but I apparently broke through it. My mother immediately called my grandmother to tell her the news. This is the record scratch moment for me. My mother was not sure whether she would keep the pregnancy. My grandmother urged her to have an abortion because she already had 2 children, was getting older, and another cesarean section would be hard on her body. My mother decided to continue the pregnancy. The first time my parents brought me to meet my grandparents, my grandmother was absolutely smitten with me. While everyone was having a good time, my mother brought up that my grandmother had urged her to get an abortion. My grandmother exploded, screaming that she never said that and asking why my mother would make it up. My mother laughed, apologized, and changed the subject. Thanks for the almost aborted funny story, Dad. Story 49. My cousin tried to murder her father with her boyfriend when she was young. He was black, she was white, and Mom and Dad did not approve. I don't remember the details, but she gave him a map of the house and they planned it. Dad woke up while the boyfriend was in the bedroom, before he could do anything. Everyone survived. Now she is a supporter of Make America Great Again and is openly racist, so I like to bring that story up at every family gathering. Story 50. My mother-in-law was showing us a group photo of her family from when she was a child. She pointed and named people. Herself with her mother and father, Uncle Bill, Cousin Rose, and Cara. I stopped her and asked if Cara was her stepmother. She confirmed and pointed out her grandmother and grandfather. I asked why her stepmother was in the picture with her parents and why she looked so young. My mother-in-law explained that Cara had been Uncle Bill and Aunt Marcia's ward after her parents died, and they took her in. I had to interrupt repeatedly because she kept glossing over the fact that her stepmother had been her father's adoptive niece and he had watched her grow up from age 7. The shocking part was that her mother hated Cara because teenage Cara had a crush on her father and would come over to do his laundry, and her mother blamed Cara for their eventual divorce. After the divorce, her father married Cara when he was 48 and she was 21. My husband was shocked to learn all of this. Story 51. I'll give you 2. One is true, one is assumed. The first one. My mother had an affair during the marriage and became pregnant. My father was aware and obviously not okay with it, but they both decided not to tell me or my siblings. The child was adopted by another couple, and we routinely visited someone we thought was a friend who was actually our half-sister. I only found out because my father had an outburst and accidentally slipped one tiny detail. I coaxed the rest from my mother over the years. I cannot verify this and refuse to ask, so I do not know whether the adoption was legal. You will see why I mentioned that later. The second one. My parents split shortly after the affair, maybe 2 to 3 years later. Most of my siblings and I ended up with my father. He often joked about killing drifters perhaps 4 or 5 times a year. I did not think much of it until about 6 to 8 years ago, when I mentioned doing an ancestry deoxyribonucleic acid test to learn more about my heritage. My mother immediately lost color in her face and told me never to submit my deoxyribonucleic acid to that service or any other, and that was that. I have thought about it a lot. What if my parents killed people in the past and got away with it? What if the woman I called my mother is not my biological mother? Story 52. In 2018, through Ancestry DNA, we discovered that my great-grandfather's brother had a daughter no one knew about. The daughter was in her 90s. We met her and held a small reunion so she could meet her 4 living half-siblings. Apparently my great-grandfather's brother, who was about 19 at the time, impregnated 2 teenage girls. One refused to marry him because he drank and gambled, so he married the other woman and they had 8 children. They had no contact with the daughter, except that he visited once when she was about 6. No one in the family knew. That generation had died. But my mother believes her grandfather would not have approved of his brother abandoning a child. My great-grandfather also had a sister. The secret daughter resembled her. Story 53. I grew up thinking my grandfather had snuck aboard a boat during World War II and come to America. After he died, I found out that he had spent almost 6 years in a Nazi labor camp just outside Poland. It was not a concentration camp, but a labor camp where he grew and harvested food for the Nazis. If he never told me while he was alive, I doubt he would have wanted to discuss it, but I have since developed a deep interest in the subject. Story 54. I took a 23andMe DNA test and at first nothing unusual appeared. About a year later, I received a message from a woman around my age asking how we were related. I was shocked. She said she was my first cousin. My dad was an only child and my mom has one brother, so of course it was Uncle Randy. She looks exactly like him. There is no denying she is his daughter. I traced the timing back. He was engaged to my aunt when my cousin was conceived. He and my aunt have been married for over 30 years and have 2 other adult children. I sent the woman some photos and gave her his contact information, but she did not want to reach out. We are now friends on social media. We have never met in person, just peering into each other's lives. She seems really cool and I would love to meet her, but it feels awkward. To my knowledge, she has never contacted him. I see my uncle about once a year, and it is strange to know this and not say anything, but I also feel it is none of my business. If she wants to reach out to him, she can. Story 55. My mother's family is one of those families where appearances are everything. It looks nice on the outside but is rotten to the core on the inside. My mother, a raging narcissist, hates her sister openly and cruelly. My aunt is no perfect victim. She is on who knows how many substances and seems to believe she is the star of a movie, while everyone else is in the background. Turns out my aunt had a secret baby. In the 1970s, she had a baby out of wedlock. She was a late teenager, went to a girl's home to have the baby, gave it up for adoption, and the entire family was sworn to strict secrecy. 40 years later, her daughter decided to reach out to get to know her biological family, and my aunt acted as if everything were normal and brought her to Christmas unannounced. None of us, besides my aunt and my mother, had any idea. We were told, "This woman is your cousin, surprise." We were expected to act as if we had always known her and that this was not shocking at all. My aunt was incredibly unstable about the whole thing and tried to insert herself into her long-lost daughter's life as if she had always been there, showing up unannounced and demanding to be at the child's parties. She pretended to be Grammy, who had been there the whole time and had as much right to be present as the adoptive family who actually raised her. She has always had major boundary issues. My poor surprise cousin disengaged and went no contact in less than 6 months. It was a complete disaster, and I feel awful for everyone involved. I realize this is probably at least part of why my aunt is so messed up. Trauma, forced adoption, being forced to pretend it never happened, and severe emotional abuse take a terrible toll. As for why my mother hates her so much, my mother is very mean. She probably never forgave her for embarrassing the family by having a baby. Story 56. Pretty tame, I guess. But I discovered on the internet that my great-great-grandfather was not only the most notorious moonshiner in his county, he also did time in prison for horse stealing from his brother. I suppose Thanksgiving was likely a tense time, at least until they brought out the moonshine. Story 57. My grandmother does not know who her father is. We think it may have been the neighbor, but there is no way to be sure at this point. Story 58. When I was researching attention deficit hyperactivity disorder symptoms, I realized that many of the quirky traits in my family were actually symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I am fairly confident that most of my extended family, including my grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins, have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder but are undiagnosed and are masking their symptoms. None of them want to know about it, and they do not believe me. Story 59. As an adult, I learned that the two people I call my aunt and uncle were actually uncle and niece to each other. My aunt is the oldest child of my grandmother, and the man I call my uncle was my grandmother's youngest sibling. In Chinese, there are specific titles for each relative, but in English we both just say uncle. They never had children and always treated my sister and me very well. I did not see him much as a teenager or adult. I am not particularly close to any of my family. No hate, I just keep them at arm's length for various reasons. He recently passed from Parkinson's disease and dementia in his 70s. My parents and aunt did not want me to see him sick. I guess they wanted to shield me and preserve his privacy and dignity. We randomly went to their house to drop off eggs during the Costco egg shortage. Everyone seemed in a good mood and I was able to say hello to him. He remembered me and was very happy. He passed a week later. My aunt said she was surprised he remembered me and that seeing me was the most lucid he had been in a while. I think it gave him peace to let go. Story 60. Using a 23andMe DNA test, my mother learned that my father's father was not his biological father. My grandmother had an affair with a man in Georgia and gave birth to my father. She took the secret to her grave. He is one of 5 children and never knew his biological father. Story 61. My shock came slowly as an adult when I realized how messed up the things I already knew were. When I was 8, my aunt had a schizophrenic break and killed her 4-year-old daughter. It was never hidden from me. I knew as soon as it happened, and I was taught young that she was not responsible for the tragedy and that her presence at holidays was never questioned. I found out a month ago that my first cousins had never been told, and I was the only child who grew up knowing the whole story. I was almost 30 before I realized that telling me was wrong. Then, at 12, my mother lost custody of me to her mother, my nan, because she would not leave a child predator. That was also never a secret from me. It was later in life that I understood what it meant that my nan kept trying to give me back to my mother, even though she stayed with that man for 7 years. Story 62. My great-great-great-grandfather was a Union soldier who temporarily served as a prison guard at Camp Chase in Ohio. I discovered this story in his diaries and journals that were passed down to me. It shocked me. At the time, the officers tried to distinguish between low-level conscripts and higher-ranking officers who were more committed to the Confederate cause. Life was hard for the conscripts as the camp grew, but they were not given additional punishment. Some were even allowed recreation, such as playing baseball. For captured higher-ranking officers who were found to have willfully rebelled, Union officers imposed severe punishments. After the war, there was strong sentiment that traitors had to be punished, so the Union set up 5-member tribunals to hear cases and pass sentences. My ancestor served on some of these tribunals. One case stood out in his writings. There was a barn on site, apparently to provide food and milk for officers and possibly prisoners, with a few dozen cattle. Captured Confederate officers would be led to the barn in handcuffs, forced to climb onto a cow backward, and lie down with their faces hanging off the animal's rear so that their faces were level with the hindquarters. The Union guards would press the man's face against the animal's hindquarters, bind him tightly in that position, and leave him there to serve his punishment. 8 hours a day for 3 days was a common sentence, and it was feared more than any other. Story 63. My brother was chemically castrated 2 months ago for a sex offense, which is legal where he is. It was his only option to avoid an indefinite extension of his prison term. He has been very depressed and has tried do-it-yourself methods to counter the effects of the drugs, but he says none of them work. Story 64. My step-uncle slept with my stepdad's first wife, which is why they did not speak to each other for a decade. I accidentally told a family member I thought knew the story. My step-uncle is the town hoe. Story 65. My grandparents on my mother's side had 8 children. Growing up, my mother led us to believe my grandfather was a great man. When I was in high school, he died of cancer. It was really tough on the whole family, but my grandmother began seeing a wealthy man 30 years younger while my grandfather was dying. She also had extensive plastic surgery and became emotionally distant from the family. Almost 15 years later, my mother and aunts received a letter from her. She revealed the truth about their relationship. He impregnated her when she was underage, about 16, and, in her words, kept her pregnant for 8 years. He assaulted and abused her for years, and no one knew. When he became ill, she finally felt brave enough to leave. Story 66. My cousin shot and killed his 6-year-old son to keep him out of the hands of his former mother-in-law, and then shot himself. They found him after the suicide note he had written and mailed arrived at his brother's house. He was a shy man who worked as a social worker. His mother-in-law was wealthy and hired lawyers to take his son from him, even though his ex-wife had never wanted the child during their marriage. Story 67. As a teenager, my mother screamed at me that at least she had come to her husband a virgin. She did not tell me until later that she had been married before my father, at age 18. That made the standard much less impressive. Story 68. My mother might have 2 brothers somewhere. Her father, my biological grandfather, was arrested shortly after my mother and her known uncle were born, barely a year apart. He escaped jail, fathered 2 more children by other women, and was eventually arrested again. He died by suicide either in jail or very shortly after his release. We are not certain exactly when, but we do know he killed himself. As for where my possible 2 uncles are, we have no clue. We only discovered this recently after my mother and I took deoxyribonucleic acid tests and matched with my mother's cousin on my grandfather's side, who revealed it. My mother is actively searching, but from what we have seen, both of the brothers were adopted and had their last names changed. Story 69. My uncle, who is married and has an only daughter, got a girl pregnant in high school and has an older son he is not involved with. The son looks exactly like him. My uncle, his wife, the son, and the son's mother all live in a small Midwestern town. So the situation is hard to avoid in their daily lives, but they all pretend it is not a problem. Story 70. My dad casually mentioned his sister, also known as my aunt, when I was 28. She had never been mentioned by him, my grandparents, or anyone, and there were no photos of her in the house. Story 71. When my grandmother died and I was 16, my mom discovered while doing paperwork that her parents had married before she was born and realized the marriage must have been forced. We moved on, and a couple of years later her husband remarried. My mom had always been told that man was her father. The woman he married was terrible and drove everyone away. One of my uncles told my mom that he was probably not her real dad, and we were stunned. It turned out my grandmother had been seeing 2 men and knew the baby was the other man's. She married the man she thought had better prospects because my biological grandfather had been arrested for some youthful mistakes. Took us 2 more years to track him down. My mom finally met her biological father when she was 40. Unfortunately, we only had a few years with him before he died suddenly from an aneurysm. It has been over 15 years and I still miss him. He was so happy to finally meet us. The wildest thing is that we all carry a very rare genetic disorder. My mom, my sister, me, and my grandfather. He was the source. It was not a random mutation. Even before we got the DNA results back, we suspected it because of that family connection. Story 72. The first shock was when I was 12 and discovered my twin brother was actually my half-brother. We have different fathers because my mother experienced superfetation. The second shock came recently at almost 40 years old, when I learned I did not actually have cancer as a child. I had been told I had human papillomavirus that turned into cervical cancer, but instead I learned I had undergone an abortion at 9 years old. My mother never told me, and I do not have many good memories growing up. Being shocked does not begin to cover that revelation. Story 73. My great-great-grandmother was severely abused by my great-great-grandfather. One day she overheard him planning to traffic their 2-year-old daughter to some co-workers. When he came home that night and fell asleep, she sewed him into their bed with the top sheet so he could not get out and killed him with a frying pan. With the help of a friend who was a sheriff in Georgia, she crossed the state line and moved to Jacksonville to avoid prosecution. A few years later, she moved to Pensacola, and that is how my family ended up here. We have been here ever since. Story 74. My sister-in-law discovered at age 31 that the man who raised her was not her biological father. She took a 23andMe deoxyribonucleic acid test, and her biological father took the same test. The results identified them as a father and daughter. The man who raised her is Native American, and her two brothers share his features, while she appears white and had always believed she was part Native American. She was involved in the culture and made many native crafts. The discovery was upsetting, but she met her biological father, a kind, well-adjusted white man who lives in the same city. She now enjoys getting to know new half-siblings, nieces, and nephews as she has adjusted to the news. Story 75. I knew my dad had a troubled childhood. He was the younger of a pair of Irish twins born to a teenage mother in the 1960s. It never occurred to me how odd it was that his older brother stayed with their mother while he went to live with his father, who was not interested in being a parent. My dad was a chronic bedwetter, and his mother left him at his father's house. Hearing that was especially hard because my brother was also a chronic bedwetter, and instead of getting him help, they made him wear diapers until middle school. Story 76. Not sure if this counts because it is not technically my family, but they raised me when my mother was dealing with her addictions. I lived with a family for a couple of years. They called me their adopted son, and I treated them like parents. They are genuinely kind people who have given the shirt off their backs to strangers, but their blind spot is their religion. They are hardcore Christians. We prayed twice a day, and they quoted the Bible regularly. They did not force their beliefs on people and often helped those who said they disliked Christianity. However, they gave devout Christians more leeway than they should have. They raised me with their two youngest sons, both around my age. They had 4 older children who had moved out. 3 of them were parents themselves. Everyone and their partners were welcoming to me. When I was young, I could not have thought of a negative thing to say about them. Their youngest daughter, who was then a mother of 3, seemed a lot younger than her husband and was close to my age. I did not think much of it. I was a teenager. Everyone looked young or old to me. She appeared to be a happy mother and a proud wife, even though one of the youngest sons, my best friend, did not like his sister's husband. I ignored it. About 10 years later, I found out through my best friend that his sister's husband was 14 years older than her and had courted her when she was 14 and he was 27 or 28. The rest of the family, with some exceptions, were okay with it because he was a pastor. When her husband made a post saying that homosexual marriage is a blasphemy, I asked him what he thought about pedophilia. He deleted the post. She has since had 6 more children, and he moved her away from her family to the South. The last time I spoke with her, she still seemed happy and proud. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.